example, hugely complicated, so I'm going to try to simplify it. I might oversimplify it. Social Security is the one you, Christina, mentioned first of all. And I think it's actually very appropriate that the Social Security Act has that word, security, in it, because it's the central leitmotif of everything that I'm trying to describe here is what the New Deal does in sector after sector after sector is it reduces risk, it introduces stability, predictability, and security. That is the great heritage of the New Deal. It makes the banking system more secure, it makes the stock exchanges less risky, it makes home ownership more possible, it makes, we're not going to go there, but it makes labor capital relationships much more manageable and stable. Stability, security is the core of the whole matter. That's the lasting legacy of the New Deal in this society. Okay. And again, and security, in my view, is brought into the society in these many different sectors in ways that, on reflection, on historical analysis, turn out to be remarkably faithful to, deferential to, in the inherited ways of operating of the private economy. Okay, all right. So let's take Social Security. I mentioned earlier that the New Deal generated a lot of terrific memoir literature. I mentioned Rexford Tugwell's book, which the title of which is The Brain Trust. But Francis Perkins, who was Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor through his entire 4 administrations, also wrote a terrific memoir in the 1940s called The Roosevelt I Knew. And I'm going to quote you a little passage from it here. And this passage, I think, it's a kind of a smoking gun that confirms for me that I'm on the right path here in trying to convince you that the New Deal was self-consciously deferential to the prerogatives of the private economy and inherited ways of operating a capitalist economy as it put these various reforms in place. Well, let me say parenthetically here, you often also hear that the New Deal had no coherent program. There was a writer in the New York Times a few years ago who said the New Deal threw a bunch of stuff at the wall and whatever stuck, that became the New Deal. That is emphatically not true. There was a coherent vision behind all of this. You can find it in Roosevelt's correspondence, in the private correspondence in the 1920s, where he repeatedly says, if we get the chance to come to power, we're going to make this society more secure and more inclusive. And we're going to reduce the volatility and explosiveness of so many of our institutions. That's what happens. Okay. In a speech in Salt Lake City, Utah, in 1930, when he was governor of New York, Roosevelt said that he hoped one day that this country would adopt a program of social insurance that would provide people financial security in their final years and old age, and would also do something about the risks of unemployment. That was a public address in 1930s, before anybody knew that the Depression was going to be the great one, and it's before he was an announced presidential candidate. And that public address is only confirmatory of things you can find in his private correspondence through the 1920s, where he's aiming at this. He had a vision, and the vision was pretty darn coherent about what he wanted to accomplish. So he asks when he approached Francis Perkins in late 1932, after the election, before his inauguration, to become his Secretary of Labor. She, in turn, asked him, are you going to live up to your promise, as announced in that Salt Lake City speech, to work for and champion a program of social insurance, old age insurance, unemployment insurance? And he said, yes. And he said, what's more, I'm going to make you, Francis, the cabinet officer who will be the political overseer of this, who will just shepherd the whole thing through. So Francis Perkins becomes a major player in the drafting of the Social Security Act. She commissioned an economist at the University of Wisconsin named Edward Witte, W-I-T-T-E, to be the chairman of something called the Committee on Economic Security, and they were given the job of drafting the legislation that eventually becomes the Social Security Act. Now, there are all kinds of interesting things that happen along the way. The original instructions were not a 2-part, but a 3-part program: old age pensions, unemployment insurance, and guess what? Universal health care. That was in the original proposal, and the committee went to work on that basis. Partway into the process, Roosevelt concluded that it was a bridge too far to go for the universal health care. There was too much opposition to that. He was afraid if he kept it in the bill, the whole bill would go down. So he instructed Perkins to instruct the Committee on Economic Security and Whitty and Company to withdraw that from the bill. We don't see it again until Medicare in the 1960s and then so-called Obamacare in our own time. So that's another part of this. We'll just leave that aside for the moment. But old age pensions and unemployment insurance remained. And Frances Perkins convened this group, and she, in her memoir, this book called The Roosevelt I Knew, page 286 if you're interested, she recounts her first encounter with this group that she's convened. She's giving them their charge, their task, their mission to draft legislation. And she says the following: I reminded them of that they needed to have a practical knowledge of the needs of our country. We need a program like this. But then she'd our legislative habits and the prejudices of our people. And she explicitly told them this. You can't just come up with a great Social Security and unemployment insurance program. You have to be deferential to our legislative habits, what'll get through the Congress, and the prejudices of our people. She just says it flat out. I mean, she's recognizing the culture and the values that inhabit that culture in which these people have to work. They're not at liberty to create some abstractly beautiful, well-designed system. They have to be deferential to what she, without apology, called the prejudices of our people. Okay, the principal prejudice that becomes operational in the drafting of the legislation is the enormous commitment not to finance the Social Security system out of general Treasury revenues, to make it a self-financing system in which employers and employees, the ultimate beneficiaries, will pay in on an annual basis through payroll taxes. In every other country that had a Social Security system in place at that time, many did. Again, we're playing catch-up in the world of advanced industrial states. Programs like this were financed out of general revenues. And the drafting team, Whitty and Company, studied those systems, and they argued repeatedly that this is the best way to do business. This is going to be a civil right. If you're a member of this society, you're going to have the right to these unemployment insurance payments and to old age payments, and every other society that does this as a civil right, and they finance out of general Treasury revenues. Roosevelt, whenever he was asked this question, or when they brought it to him, are we going to finance it this way, he would say, no, that's the dole, and we're not going to have a dole. We're going to be self-financed. We're going to model this on a private insurance scheme, not a public welfare program. So the drafting team wrestled with this. The drafting team had actuaries and demographers on it and so on and so forth. And they concluded that the only way they could do this was to make it self-financing for the first 50 years or so, but at some point in the 1980s, there was going to be a deficit in the system that would have to be made up out of general Treasury revenues. This was sort of their last-ditch stand. Okay, we'll defer general revenues for 50 years, but at some point, we're going to have to finance this system out of general Treasury revenues. So they brought this to Roosevelt, and he listened to them, and he thought for a minute, and then he said, again, I'm quoting from Frances Perkins' memoir, he said, but that's the same old dole under another name. It is dishonest to build up an accumulated deficit for the Congress of the United States to meet in 1980. We can't do that. We can't sell the U.S. short in 1980 any more than in 1935. No general revenues, no dole. So what do we get? We get a Social Security system that just about uniquely in the array of comparable systems around the world is not financed out of general government revenues, but out of this pay-as-you-go system. And it becomes, in essence, to put it this way, in our society, old age, let's just stick with the old age pension part of it, leave unemployment insurance aside for the moment. Old age pensions are not a civil right, but a property right. Very, very different conceptual basis for putting this system together. Now, all the actuaries and the economists and so on the committee thought this was a terrible way to go, and they made their displeasure about this apparent to many people. And there was a famous exchange, famous amongst those of us who study this stuff, between an economist by the name of Luther Gulick and Franklin Roosevelt in 1942, where Gulick once again said, you know, Mr. President, you put together this Social Security system. It's a great system, but it's financed the wrong way. It shouldn't be financed on the basis of these employee contributions and payroll taxes and so on. And so here is what